Have you ever buried your heart with someone you loved and believed it would never beat the same again? Charles Whitmore did. A brilliant pharmaceutical CEO, once hailed for saving lives until the woman he loved most lost hers to a disease he couldn't cure. From that day forward, he built walls no one could climb and called it healing. But life has its own way of testing the walls we build. When a mysterious assistant named Grace Miller enters his world, everything he thought he had buried begins to resurface: memories, regrets, and a haunting truth that could undo everything. What would you do if the person you trusted turned out to be the one holding a mirror to your deepest fault? Would you defend your legacy or choose to redeem your soul? This isn't a story about villains or heroes. It's a story about what we do when the truth knocks softly at first, then all at once. If you find this story touching, comment 1. If you think this video needs improvement, comment 2. Now take a breath and let us bring you to the beginning, where grief met courage and love asked for a second chance. He buried his heart with his wife, but life had other plans. The sun rose quietly over San Francisco, casting a pale gold hue across the bay, in a high-rise penthouse overlooking the water. Charles Whitmore stirred from sleep not because of an alarm, but because his mind had already started planning the day. He sat upright, feet touching the hardwood floor with practiced precision. 5:31 a.m. Like everything in his life, it was controlled, deliberate, clean. He slipped into his routine black coffee from the same French press he'd used for a decade, exactly 2 tablespoons of coarse ground. Shower at 5:45. Crisp navy suit by 6:10, ties aligned by shade and occasion. Charles had built Whitmore Pharmaceuticals into one of the most powerful names in the industry. And today wasn't just another day. It was the day they would unveil the breakthrough pain management technology the market had long awaited. A solution for chronic pain that could replace traditional opioids, eliminate dependency, and secure his company's legacy. But as he straightened his tie in the mirror, his reflection held a flicker of something absent, like a frame with the photo removed. The corner of the mirror was cracked, a small hairline fracture. He hadn't fixed it. She used to lean against that very spot while brushing her hair, soft red waves tumbling over her shoulders. Anna, his wife, gone 8 years this spring. Cancer had taken her quickly. Too quickly. He'd tried to keep her comfortable near the end. The medications didn't help. Nothing helped. He stopped visiting the hospital after the 5th week. She told him he was working too hard, that he was trying to outrun grief before it arrived. And when it did, it moved in quietly without protest and unpacked itself in the empty bed, the untouched closet, the way he no longer listened to music while shaving. After Anna's funeral, he told himself emotions were liabilities. That logic and efficiency would shield him from ever losing that kind of control again. He was mostly right. Until this morning. At exactly 6:27 a.m., his phone buzzed. Text from Patricia, his longtime assistant and right hand for nearly 15 years. Emergency appendectomy last night. I'll be out for 2 weeks minimum. HR has assigned a temporary replacement. Her name is Grace Miller. She'll meet you in the lobby at 8. Sorry, Charles. Charles blinked at the message. Patricia never missed a thing. Not flights, not deadlines, not even birthdays of board members' spouses. This threw a wrinkle into what was supposed to be the most controlled day of the quarter. He didn't like wrinkles. He texted back a simple, "Understood, rest well," then opened the personnel file HR had sent. Grace Miller, age 35, background admin, operations, discreet, no incidents, no awards, no promotions, no face photo. Of course not. Charles closed the file. A name was just a placeholder until someone proved otherwise. At 7:55 a.m., he stepped into the lobby of the Whitmore Tower. His black sedan waited curbside. Driver ready, documents prepped, all in place, except her. He glanced at his watch. 7:59. The elevator doors slid open. Out stepped a woman in a gray tailored coat, dark hair pinned neatly, carrying a leather briefcase. She walked with the calm focus of someone used to moving unnoticed. "Mr. Whitmore?" she asked, her voice steady but soft. He nodded. "I'm Grace Miller. Thank you for allowing me to assist today. I've reviewed the presentation materials and cross-checked the schedule. Your first meeting is at 10:30. The documents are loaded in the car." She offered no smile, no small talk, just facts. He appreciated that. Charles studied her for a moment, quiet, efficient, unremarkable, yet something in her tone, like she'd spoken to him before, or knew things she wasn't saying. He dismissed the thought. He didn't believe in intuitions. Not anymore. "Let's go," he said, stepping outside into the cool morning light. As the car pulled away from the curb, Charles stared out the window while Grace sat beside him, reviewing documents without a word. In the distance, fog rolled over the Golden Gate Bridge like a slow, deliberate tide. He didn't know it yet, but nothing about this day would unfold according to plan. The woman beside him wasn't just here to assist. She was here to open a chapter of his life that he had sealed shut long ago. The drive to Carmel took just under 3 hours, cutting along winding highways that overlooked the Pacific Ocean. The sun had climbed higher by the time Charles's black sedan rolled through the stone gate of Madison Resort, nestled into the cliffs of California's coast. It had been 10 years since he last set foot there. The place hadn't changed. The trimmed hedges, the scent of salt in the breeze, the sound of seagulls somewhere behind the hills. Only now it felt colder, or maybe that was just him. Grace sat quietly beside him, glancing at a printed itinerary. Her eyes moved quickly, pen tapping lightly against the margin as she adjusted a note. Not once had she asked for clarification. She simply knew. Charles wasn't used to that. The car pulled up to the front entrance. Bell staff moved like clockwork. A valet opened the door. Charles stepped out first, and Grace followed, not waiting for help with her luggage. They walked into the lobby vaulted ceilings, oak beams, the same scent of eucalyptus and lavender they used back then. Anna had loved it here. They had come to Madison for anniversaries, for getaways, even once on a random Tuesday when the city felt too heavy. She used to curl up in the oversized chairs by the fireplace with a book and red wine. It had been their place. Now, walking into it with someone else felt wrong, like trespassing on memory. "Your suite is on the 3rd floor, Ocean View," Grace said, glancing up from her phone. Check-in was handled remotely. The key is digital. Charles nodded, his lips a thin line. "And yours, North Wing, standard single." She said it without hesitation, without waiting for approval, like she already knew he preferred space, privacy. Later that afternoon, while Charles prepared slides in the conference room, Grace entered silently and placed a cup of coffee beside him. He looked down. Cream, no sugar. Exactly how he drank it. He blinked. "Did Patricia tell you no, sir?" she replied, not looking up from her notepad. "I saw you add cream but leave the sugar packet untouched at breakfast." It wasn't just the coffee. At lunch, she handed him the exact document he needed before he asked. During a meeting, she adjusted the thermostat in the room moments before he realized it was too warm. She scheduled a 15-minute buffer between his sessions, knowing he liked to review alone before speaking. It was like she had spent years working with him. But she hadn't. Not even a day. He found himself watching her more closely. Not in the way younger men look at beautiful women, though Grace was, in a subtle, graceful way, but in the way one watches a puzzle slowly assembling itself without ever seeing the box. It wasn't her appearance. It was her presence, like she was meant to be there, though he couldn't explain why. That evening, Charles returned to his suite as the sky outside began to turn the color of peach and amber. The ocean, restless and vast, stretched endlessly past his window. He set his briefcase down and walked to the minibar. There, next to the espresso machine, was a small bowl of sugar cubes and a creamer pitcher. But no packets, no stirrers. He frowned. The setup reminded him of something. He stood still. Anna used to do that. She hated the waste of single-use sugar packets. She would bring her own cubes from home, even when they traveled, even here. The hotel must have changed the standard amenities since then, or perhaps someone had asked. He turned away, unsettled by the sudden throb in his chest. Later that night, after a quiet dinner with board members, Charles returned to the suite. He expected silence. Instead, he found a handwritten note on the table. Your presentation has been revised per the last-minute policy update. I moved slides 14 and 17 as discussed. The draft is in your inbox. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments before the morning. Grace. Professional, efficient, but there was something in her handwriting looped, thoughtful, the kind of penmanship people don't learn anymore. Anna wrote like that. He closed the note, placed it beside his laptop, and sat down. For the first time in a very long time, Charles felt unsteady. It wasn't fear, or attraction, or grief. It was something quieter, something like familiarity, something like being known. The second day at Madison Resort unfolded with quiet efficiency. The conference meetings flowed smoothly, investor sessions, partner briefings, back-to-back strategic presentations. Everything moved like gears in a well-oiled machine. But Charles felt something unusual. Ease. Grace was always one step ahead. Without being prompted, she arranged documents in his preferred layout, offered context to certain names on the guest list, and kept unnecessary conversations from reaching him. She adjusted seating placements so the natural light didn't glare against the screen during his pitch. She even lowered the room's music before Charles had to ask. She didn't hover, she didn't interrupt, but she was always there, like a thought just before it turned into words. And for the first time in years, Charles didn't feel like he had to carry everything alone. That was new. By late afternoon, the last meeting had ended, and the sky outside shifted into a soft watercolor clouds, catching gold and blush pink above the western horizon. Charles declined the cocktail mixer. Instead, he walked the length of the resort's cliffside promenade. The ocean stretched endlessly beside him, waves kissing the rocks with ancient patience. As he rounded a bend near the gardens, he saw someone sitting on a wooden bench just beyond the path. Her back was to him, posture relaxed, yet focused. She held a pen in one hand and a small journal in the other. It was Grace. She hadn't noticed him. Her head was slightly bowed, hair loose now, brushing the collar of her navy sweater. The breeze played with it gently. One foot tapped slowly to some rhythm only she heard. She wasn't working. She was writing. Charles hesitated, then stepped closer, his voice quiet but clear. "Didn't expect to see you off the grid," he said. Grace looked up. There was no surprise on her face, just the calm acceptance of someone used to being alone. Even machines need a break, she replied, offering a small, knowing smile. He chuckled once. What are you writing? A letter, she said, then paused. Well, not really. More like thoughts I can't quite put into categories yet. Business. She shook her head. Personal. Charles nodded, unsure whether to sit or walk away. Grace answered the dilemma for him by scooting a few inches down the bench. There was room. So he sat. The sea roared below them, deep and distant. I used to come here with my wife, he said after a moment. This very path. We stayed in the same suite every year. She loved the sound of the water at night. Grace didn't respond right away. She let the space settle between them like sand. I came here with my mother once, she said finally. Only once. But I remember it vividly. Charles turned to her slightly. She was a nurse, strong, smart, fiercely honest. That kind of honesty that doesn't always do well in corporate settings. There was a pause. She died 5 years ago, Grace continued, voice soft but unwavering. It wasn't just illness. It was what came before. She tried to speak up, to tell the truth about something she'd seen. But no one listened, or worse, they made sure her voice didn't carry. Charles felt the muscles in his jaw tighten, instinctively defensive, but Grace wasn't accusing. She was remembering. She was let go, quietly, professionally, no lawsuits, no headlines, just a woman who had spent her life helping others, now jobless and unheard. She didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed on the horizon. Not every truth finds its way to the surface, she said quietly. But the sea remembers. The words floated between them. Heavy, honest, unfinished. Charles didn't know what to say, and perhaps, for once, that was the point. He looked out toward the water again. The waves were soft now, rhythmic, like breathing. Grace closed her journal and stood. I should go prepare your materials for tomorrow's keynote, she said, brushing the sand from her coat. Charles nodded, rising slowly. Thank you, he said, not for the work, for something else he couldn't yet name. She gave him a glance measured, thoughtful, then walked back up the path, disappearing behind the trellis of climbing ivy. Charles remained behind for a while longer. The bench felt colder without her, and the sea louder. The grand ballroom at Madison Resort shimmered in warm amber light, casting soft glows on glassware, linen, and polished wood floors. It was the kind of evening designed to impress wine glasses never empty, conversations always circling back to mergers, markets, and mutual gains. Charles had hosted evenings like this before, countless, in fact, yet tonight felt off-center. Maybe it was the scent of eucalyptus in the air, the same as the room where Anna had spent her last anniversary. Or the music old jazz standards, not quite loud enough to distract, just soft enough to stir memory. He stood near the fireplace, nursing a glass of neat scotch, watching names in suits orbit each other like polite planets. Tom Barlow, his longtime CFO, approached. "Where's your shadow?" Tom asked casually, scanning the room. Charles smirked, probably adjusting the lighting or predicting tomorrow's headlines. "She's efficient," Tom said, raising his brows. "Almost too efficient." Charles didn't reply. Instead, his gaze drifted toward the ballroom entrance, where a new wave of guests arrived. And then time slowed. She stood beneath the arch of golden sconces, still, poised, grace, but not the grace in gray coats and quiet presence. This grace wore a deep emerald dress, floor length, with a simple slit that moved like silk in water. Her hair, normally bound in quiet submission, now fell in soft waves down her shoulders. No glasses. A pair of understated earrings caught the light each time she turned. She wasn't trying to be noticed, but she was seen. Conversations tapered. Eyes followed. And Charles blinked. She walked with that same quiet confidence, but tonight it carried something else, self-possession. She made her way toward the crowd, acknowledging nods, speaking softly with a few colleagues she had met earlier that day. No false charm, just quiet composure. Tom elbowed him lightly. "Still think she's just admin support." Charles said nothing. The evening blurred into wine and hors d'oeuvres. Charles found himself distracted, half-hearted in conversations, glancing toward the space where Grace stood. When their eyes finally met across the room, she held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Not flirtatious, not cold, just present. Later, during the formal dance portion of the evening, someone from the board approached her, asking for a waltz. Grace declined with grace. Then, moments later, she turned toward Charles and nodded once. It was barely perceptible, but he moved. They met on the dance floor as the quartet began an old Sinatra tune. Charles offered his hand. She took it. Her fingers were warm. "You clean up well," he said, almost awkwardly. Grace gave a soft smile. "So do you." Their steps fell into sync with surprising ease. Charles hadn't danced in years, not since Anna. And yet, somehow, Grace made it effortless. For a moment, the ballroom faded. There was only the rhythm, the soft pressure of her palm, and the question rising in his chest. He asked it when the song ended and the applause politely fluttered. "Would you like some air?" he said. She nodded. They stepped out onto the terrace, the cool sea breeze meeting them like a long-forgotten friend. Below, the ocean rolled gently, waves gleaming under a half-moon. Lights from the ballroom flickered behind them like a separate world. Grace leaned against the railing. Charles stood beside her, hands in his pockets. The silence wasn't heavy. It felt earned. "You don't look like the woman I met yesterday," he said at last. She turned her head slightly toward him. "And you don't seem like the man they describe in the press." He chuckled, then looked away. "Is that a compliment or a warning?" "Just an observation." He glanced at her, really looked. "It's strange," he said slowly. "You've been here less than 2 days, and yet I feel familiar," she offered gently. He nodded. "Exactly that." Grace turned back toward the ocean. Some things echo before we realize we've heard them before. A beat of quiet passed. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, Charles asked, "Who are you?" "Grace Miller." She didn't answer, not right away. Instead, she looked out over the waves, her profile catching the silver light. A softness in her eyes, a sadness he hadn't noticed before. Finally, she turned toward him and said calmly, "Clearly, we'll get to that, when the time is right." And then she walked back inside, leaving Charles alone with a breeze, a question, and the growing realization that the woman he thought he understood might just be someone he'd never truly seen at all. The third day at Madison Resort dawned crisp and quiet. Charles rose early, as always, though the sleep he'd gotten was thinner than usual, more like a pause in thought than true rest. He'd dreamed of waves, of a woman he knew and didn't. After the gala, Grace had remained composed, distant, polite. Nothing changed in her professional demeanor, but something had shifted, and he couldn't name it. Not yet. Mid-morning, after the final keynote session ended, Charles stepped out to the garden terrace for some air. Grace was already there. She sat on a stone bench beneath a sycamore tree, sunlight weaving through its leaves, scattering light across the page of her journal. She closed it as he approached. He hesitated. "I feel like I owe you an apology," Charles said. Grace tilted her head slightly. "For what?" "For asking something last night I didn't earn the right to ask." She smiled faintly. "You asked a fair question, Mr. Whitmore." "Charles." "Okay," she said softly. "Charles." He sat down beside her. "Not too close, not too far." "Let me answer it," she said, eyes fixed on the trees. "Who I am." He didn't move. "My full name is Grace Eleanor Miller." Charles turned his head sharply at the middle name. A shiver passed down his spine. "Eleanor. She was my mother." Silence. Grace continued. Her voice wasn't angry, just steady. She was a registered nurse for over 20 years. Quiet, kind, a bit old-fashioned. She loved her patients, and she believed in truth, even when it was inconvenient. Charles swallowed, something tightening behind his ribs. "She worked at a private pain clinic affiliated with Whitmore Pharmaceuticals," Grace said. "Back when your company was piloting a line of high-dose opioid medications." He closed his eyes briefly. She noticed Pattern's patients showing signs of early addiction, side effects that weren't listed, prescriptions that doubled every few months. She raised concerns to her supervisor, then to the regional office. Grace looked at him now, and then, very suddenly, she was dismissed. Charles looked away. The wind stirred. She was told she violated protocol, that she was disruptive to company alignment. But what really happened, Charles, is that no one wanted to listen. He felt it deep in the center of his chest, recognition, a name, a file, a case handled by legal. Quietly, "I remember," he said, barely audible. "There was a report, one paragraph. I didn't know the details. I was 30, Grace said, still trying to build my career, watching the woman who raised me fall apart." Charles couldn't look at her. She lost everything, her job, her reputation. Friends stopped calling. She was never accused of anything publicly, but the silence was worse. It erased her. She passed away 11 months later. Heart failure, they said, but no one dies of just that, not when grief has already hollowed them out. Tears didn't fall from her eyes. They stayed contained, welled, but controlled, just like her. "I didn't come here to ruin you, Charles," she said quietly. He finally met her gaze. "I didn't come to demand revenge or justice, or whatever it is people think the daughter of a ruined woman should want. I came to see if you had a heart. If the man who built this empire could feel anything beyond quarterly gains and product launches." He was silent. "I watched you from a distance for 18 months, she continued. "Took a job at a small branch. Learned the company from the inside. Not to take it down, but to see if it could change. If you could." Charles stared at the ground. His thoughts spiraled. Names, boardrooms, decisions made under pressure. He hadn't thought of Eleanor Miller in years, and now her daughter sat beside him, not screaming, not accusing, just asking to be seen. "You didn't know," Grace said, "but now you do, and knowing changes things." "Doesn't it?" Charles closed his eyes. "Yes," he said, voice hoarse. "Yes, it does." They sat in silence. The breeze picked up, carrying the scent of sea air and something else, memory. Maybe. Grace stood slowly, brushed her coat sleeve. "I have a meeting to prep for," she said, quiet but firm. Charles didn't stop her, but as she walked away, her words lingered. "I came to see if you had a heart." And for the first time in years, He wasn't sure how to answer. The room was too quiet, and yet too loud. Charles sat in the armchair by the window of his suite, staring out at the inky black horizon beyond Carmel Bay. A full moon hung low, pale and knowing. The luxury around him, marble floors, vintage decanter, custom lighting felt like paper walls. Useless, decorative, not protective. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, her voice came back, not Grace's, Anna's, his late wife. Are you proud of everything you've built, Charles, even if it meant stepping over people you'll never meet? He had dismissed the question then, with a kiss, with silence, with the gentle arrogance of a man who thought the world would forgive him for being efficient. But tonight, it echoed with unbearable clarity. He stood up, poured himself a glass of water. It tasted like regret. Charles had always been a man of structure. He conquered chaos with plans, turned emotions into spreadsheets. But tonight, no amount of logic could insulate him from one truth. There had been casualties, and now one of them had a name, a face, a daughter, and she wasn't angry. That more than anything unraveled him. It was nearly midnight when Charles stepped out of the resort and walked toward the beach. The air was cool, layered with salt and memory, the kind of air that peeled back pretenses. Sand crunched beneath his loafers, and then he saw her, Grace, sitting alone again on the same bench near the shore, backlit by moonlight. She didn't turn when he approached, didn't flinch. She'd known he would come. Charles stopped beside her. Neither of them spoke. The waves filled the silence, for them rising, retreating, endless. After a long moment, he sat down, not close, but close enough. He didn't know what to say. She didn't ask him to. Some mistakes, Charles said quietly, breaking the stillness. Live longer than we do. Grace turned slightly. Her eyes caught the moonlight, softened by fatigue, but still quietly alert. I didn't come to hear you apologize, she replied, voice low. I know, he said, but I need to anyway. She looked back toward the water. Charles exhaled, slow and shaky. He felt like a man walking barefoot over glass, aware of every step, every past decision that now cut differently. I built an empire, Grace, brick by brick, deal by deal, and for years I convinced myself I was doing good, creating jobs, funding research, saving lives. He paused, but I also knew when to look away. Grace didn't speak. She let the admission float in the dark like a confession too heavy for daylight. I didn't know what happened to your mother. Not fully, but I knew. Someone was silenced. Someone paid the price so we wouldn't lose momentum. She folded her hands in her lap, still wordless. Anna, my wife. She once asked me if I ever lied to get where I was, if I ever buried anything. He looked up at the sky, eyes glassy. I said no, but I think I buried the truth so deeply I believed it wasn't there. Silence again, and then Grace said something so quiet, so fragile, it nearly disappeared under the sound of waves. She never wanted revenge, just to be heard. Charles nodded slowly, and I never listened. She looked at him, finally, fully. You're listening now. He let out a breath that felt like it had waited years to leave him. I thought, if I kept building, I could outrun it. He admitted, the past, my doubts, but it catches up. Always. Yes, Grace said softly, but it doesn't have to win. A breeze passed between them, brushing away something heavy. Charles rubbed his temples, suddenly exhausted. I don't know how to fix it, he said. You don't, she answered gently. You just start from where it broke. She stood up. He looked up. unsure if she was leaving for good. But instead, she took a small, folded note from her coat pocket, placed it on the bench beside him. "For when you're ready," she said. And then, without waiting for a reply, she stepped barefoot into the sand, walking slowly toward the shoreline, just far enough to let the tide touch her toes. She stood there, a silhouette against the moonlight, letting the waves wash over her feet, again and again. Charles stayed behind. The paper in his hand felt heavier than it looked. He didn't unfold it, not yet. Instead, he looked out toward Grace, and above them both, the moon kept watch. The morning came quietly. The sun crept through the linen drapes, painting golden streaks across the hotel room. But Charles had been awake long before it arrived. He hadn't unfolded the letter yet. It remained where Grace left it, still sealed, as if its weight could shift, depending on whether he was brave enough to open it. But his decision had already taken root. By 9 a.m., the conference room was filled. Executives, investors, legal counsel, public relations, all sharp suits and sharper expectations. They were here for a milestone, the launch, the product, the next chapter in pharmaceutical profit. Charles entered with no fanfare, just a folder tucked under his arm and eyes that had finally stopped blinking away what needed to be seen. He stood at the head of the table, cleared his throat once, looked each person in the eye. "There will be no product launch," he said plainly. A silence fell so heavy it seemed to tilt the room. Robert, his head of operations, was the first to speak. "I'm sorry, what we're suspending release of the formula indefinitely. Further research is needed. Independent, thorough, ethical research." Another voice, this time from the investor side. "You're risking the company's biggest financial win in 5 years." "No," Charles said calmly. "I'm protecting its soul." Murmurs turned to protests. Questions erupted like sparks. "Are you being blackmailed? Is this about the press? Do you realize what this does to our quarterly targets?" Charles listened, then raised a hand. "Not every cost shows up on a spreadsheet." Silence again. "We've all gotten very good at justifying discomfort," he continued, "at reducing side effects to fine print, at measuring success in numbers, not names." He held up a piece of paper from his folder. A photo. A young nurse, bright-eyed, brave. Her name was Eleanor Miller. She believed in truth. She spoke up when our research had holes, and we erased her. No one dared move. This is not about guilt. It's about responsibility. He paused, looked out the window at the distant Pacific. "I am stepping down as CEO." Gasps filled the room, effective immediately. Robert stood, stunned. "Charles, this company is your life." "No," Charles replied gently. "It was my life, but I want something better to outlive me." By noon, the press had caught wind. Headlines multiplied. Pharma giant halts release amid ethical questions. Whitmore resigns in surprise move. Anonymous nurse sparks corporate reckoning. Microphones crowded outside the hotel. Reporters waited with practiced anticipation. Charles stepped outside alone. No PR handler, no rehearsed lines. He faced the sea of cameras with the same steadiness he once reserved for boardrooms. "You'll be hearing about a new foundation," he said into the flashing lights. "The Eleanor Miller Fund. It will support independent research in community health. No patents, no profits, just progress." What caused this change? Someone shouted. Charles paused, then smiled a tired, real smile. A conversation I should have had years ago. That night, back in his room. Charles finally opened Grace's letter. It wasn't long. Just a few handwritten lines. "My mother always believed the truth mattered more than the noise that tried to drown it. And I think, somewhere in you, she hoped someone still did too. Thank you for proving her right. At the bottom was a pressed forget-me-not, blue, fragile, steadfast. Charles held it between his fingers, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel hollow. The house was quiet. Grace stood in the small living room of her childhood home, walls still painted in pale rose, the curtains slightly faded from years of sunlight. Dust floated gently in the afternoon light, like time itself had slowed its breath to let her linger here. She hadn't returned since her mother passed. It felt smaller now. Or maybe she had simply grown beyond the weight of silence it used to carry. The shoebox was right where she remembered, in the bottom drawer of the old pine cabinet, wrapped in her mother's favorite scarf. Lavender silk, worn soft with age. Inside, photos, a hospital badge, a few letters, and one envelope. Still sealed, still untouched. It had her name on it. Grace. No last name, no date. Just her first name, written in the delicate, looping script she could recognize in the dark. She had found this letter years ago but couldn't bear to open it. What if it said goodbye? What if it explained everything and broke her all over again? But now, something had changed. Grace took the envelope and sat at the edge of the couch, the same one her mother used to nap on during long shifts. She held the letter in her lap like something sacred. And then, finally, she opened it. The paper was thin, and the ink slightly smudged in one corner. But the words, those were steady. My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get to say things properly. Maybe I was too proud. Maybe I thought I had more time. But here's what matters most. I see you. All of you. Even the fire you try to hide. Even the pain you pretend you don't carry. Grace paused, eyes stinging already. There are people in this world who will hurt others and never lose sleep. But you, Grace, you were never made for revenge. I know you're angry. I know what happened to me hurt you in ways you may never fully understand. But please, don't let that become your compass. Don't let my story turn into a weapon. Let it become a light. Don't turn justice into punishment. Turn it into healing. Grace pressed the paper to her chest. A soft sob escaped her lips. Not the kind pulled from grief, but from recognition. From being seen without having to explain. You have something I never had, someone who might still listen. If that day comes, speak gently, even if your truth shakes the room. Healing isn't loud, sweetheart. Sometimes it's just two people choosing not to break each other, even when they could. And Grace, whatever you decide to do, I trust you. I trust your heart more than any court or cause or campaign. With all my love, Mom. Tears streamed freely now, but they weren't bitter. Grace cried for the years they lost, for the words left unsaid, but mostly she cried because this letter didn't ask for justice. It asked for grace, and finally she understood the name she'd been given, not as a label, but as a legacy. She folded the letter slowly, deliberately, held it to her lips, then placed it back into the box, not to forget but to carry forward. Outside, a breeze stirred the curtains. Grace stood up, eyes clear for the first time in days. She looked around the home one more time, not as a museum of sorrow, but as the place that raised a woman who had just decided she wouldn't fight to hurt. She would fight to heal. 2 weeks passed. The world moved on as it always does. But some things... Wait. Grace pulled into the long, winding drive of Madison Resort, the Pacific breeze already brushing her cheeks before she stepped out of the car. The sky wore its late afternoon gold, softening the edges of everything it touched. She hadn't planned to come back. Not here, not now. But something had pulled her gently but persistently, like the tide reaching for the shore. The same way she used to reach for her mother's hand without looking. She walked through the main lobby, past the polished floors, past the concierge who gave her a quiet nod of recognition, and then up to the rooftop terrace, where it had all begun. Charles was already there, no suit, no assistant, no pretense, just a man standing alone, looking out at the ocean like it held answers to questions no one else could hear. He turned the moment she stepped onto the terrace. For a second, neither of them spoke. Grace took in the subtle changes. He looked different, not younger, not older, but lighter, somehow. As if he'd stopped carrying things that weren't meant to be his. His voice was quiet, but steady. "I didn't know if you'd come." Grace stepped closer. Neither did I. They stood a few feet apart, the wind playing softly with the hem of her coat. The silence between them not uncomfortable, but sacred. Charles looked down, then back at her. His eyes were clearer now, grounded. "I can't fix everything," he said, "but I'll never stop trying." Grace blinked. A slow breath escaped her, and then she smiled. Small, certain. "Then start," she whispered, stepping forward until their hands nearly touched, by not saying another word. And just like that, the space between them vanished. Grace leaned in first, or maybe Charles did. It didn't matter, because by the time their lips met, the world had fallen away. There was no clock, no boardroom, no past too heavy to carry. Just a kiss, soft, searching, then sure. It wasn't the kind of kiss born of longing or fueled by desperation. It was the kind that said, "I see you, and I'm still here," the kind that lingers, not on skin but in memory. Around them, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sea in copper and fire. Birds passed overhead, the waves whispered beneath the cliffs, and two people stood still, suspended in a moment that time politely chose not to measure. When they finally parted, neither spoke right away. There was no need to. Charles reached for her hand. Grace let him. And together they turned to watch the sun disappear beneath the ocean, the same ocean that once held sorrow, now cradling something else, something softer, something new. Exactly 1 year had passed. The Eleanor Miller Foundation, once just an idea scribbled in the margins of an apology, had become a lifeline. 12 local hospitals now ran community programs focused on opioid recovery, offering not just treatment, but hope. Real, structured, human hope. Grace stood behind a polished wooden podium in the main auditorium of the Santa Clara Medical Summit. The room was full. Health professionals, advocates, researchers, some in lab coats, others in cardigans, some with stories written in the lines of their faces. She took a breath. This was not the Grace Miller from the first day at Madison Resort, not the temporary assistant with steady hands and unreadable eyes. This was Grace Morrison Miller, daughter of a nurse, survivor of silence, speaker of truth. She began with the facts. Last year, the Eleanor Miller Foundation helped over 3,000 patients find care outside of prescription pads. But those are just numbers. Behind them are people, families, lives. The projector behind her shifted images, smiling nurses, recovery rooms repainted with sunlight, mothers reunited with children. But then, Grace paused. Her fingers brushed the edge of the podium, and she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She let her voice soften. "My mother was a nurse for 28 years. She didn't have a foundation or a platform. She just had her name, and it was taken from her." The room held its breath. "She raised me to believe that truth matters. that even when the world doesn't reward you for it, you still speak it. She died before she could clear her name. But she didn't die without teaching me what matters most. Grace's voice didn't waver. That forgiveness is not weakness. It's strength. It's not a reward. It's a beginning. She let the words linger. Then, slowly, her eyes drifted downward to the first row. Charles sat quietly. No longer the towering CEO in a custom-tailored suit. Just a man in a navy blue sweater, hands folded in his lap, listening not to defend, not to speak next, but to receive. When their eyes met, they both smiled. It was small, unspoken, but it was enough. 1 year earlier, the fallout had been enormous. The moment Charles withdrew the opioid rollout, headlines exploded, stock dipped. Angry shareholders demanded resignations. News anchors debated motives. Analysts questioned his sanity. And yet he remained calm. He stepped down, quietly, without drama, without bitterness. Not every cost shows up on a spreadsheet, he told the board, but some costs, if left unpaid, will bankrupt your soul. He redirected a portion of his fortune into the foundation, not to restore his image, but to restore something else. The man who once built walls with precision began building bridges instead. Grace didn't return to the company, but she didn't disappear either. Together, they built something new, the foundation, the programs, the healing. Grace took the lead. Charles stayed behind the scenes, writing checks, showing up when it mattered, and, most importantly, listening. Their relationship, like the sea outside Madison Resort, had its tides. They didn't rush. They learned to be still with each other, to talk without armor, to love without trying to control the shape of it. Back in the auditorium, Grace finished her talk. The room erupted into applause, but she didn't soak it in. She looked again at Charles. He stood, slowly, hands still clasped, no cameras, no headlines, just two people in a quiet exchange that said, "We made it." Later that afternoon, they returned to the ocean. Not the rooftop this time, but the actual shore, barefoot in the sand, their shoes dangling from their hands. Grace's hair danced in the wind. Charles rolled his pants up to the calves, the sea foam licking his ankles. No one needed to say what this place meant. The sea had heard their confessions. Now, it cradled their peace. They stopped near the rocks, where tide pools formed little mirrors between the stones. Grace looked out at the horizon. She would have liked this. She whispered. Charles nodded. She'd be proud of you. A pause. She'd be proud of you, too, Grace said quietly. He turned to her. You think so? She reached up, touched the soft gray at his temples. Not because of the foundation or the hospitals, but because you finally let someone see your heart. He looked down. It's not a perfect heart. She smiled, brushing her fingers against his. That's the only kind worth loving. They didn't kiss this time. They didn't need to. They walked along the shore as the sky shifted from gold to deep lavender. Two silhouettes etched against the rhythm of the tide. The past behind them not erased, but honored. The future ahead not guaranteed, but chosen, together. As we grow older, we learn that healing doesn't always come with time. It comes with courage. Courage to face the truth, to own our mistakes, and to forgive others and ourselves. Charles Whitmore built a life of success, but it wasn't until he lost everything he thought defined him that he discovered what truly mattered: human connection, accountability, and redemption. And Grace Miller taught us that justice doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes it speaks in quiet decisions, in letters unread for years, in the bravery of showing up when it's easier to walk away. This story reminds us that it's never too late to choose integrity over comfort or love over pride. It's never too late to repair what's been broken, not perfectly, but honestly. Whether you're 55 or 85, you still have the power to rewrite a chapter. Not for the applause, but for the peace it brings your heart. Because in the end, the legacy we leave behind isn't measured in wealth, but in the lives we've healed, the truths we've honored, and the forgiveness we've dared to give. Thank you for spending your precious time with this story. If it touched your heart even just a little, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling meaningful stories, stories that heal, connect, and remind us all that we are not alone. See you in the next story, where emotions speak louder than words.